Hi, I'm Sarah Wheaton. I'm the Chief Policy Correspondent at Politico Europe, zooming in here with you from Brussels. And I'm joined in London today by Mark Leonard. He's the co-founder and director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Mark, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Hi, lovely to talk to you.
So last fall, you published a book called The Age of Unpeace. And first, can you start out explaining what you mean by unpeace?
So my argument was that we were not, at that time before the war in Ukraine, living through the golden age of peace, which many people had predicted that we would have after the end of the Cold War, where the world was bound together through ties of trade, the internet, and solutions to shared problems. But instead, I argued that even though the world was very closely bound up together, there was a huge amount of tension and competition between different powers, and that those powers were turning the ties that bind us together into weapons to hurt each other, to push, to move their interests forward and to harm others. And that we would see an increasing amount of tension going on through the weaponization of these links, whether it was through energy cutoffs, through sanctions, through cyber attacks, through the weaponization of migration. It would neither be a period of peace, nor would it be the sort of conventional wars just fought between raging armies that we got used to in earlier generations. And I think that what that means is also that it's very unlikely that even if there is a sort of peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine, that we will end up leaving the age of unpeace, that these sort of tensions will carry on in the future. And what has been very striking about the war in Ukraine is how different it is from, on the one hand, though, kind of on the surface, it looks like 1956, 1968 with Soviet tanks going over different borders. A lot of the action is actually taking place in this sort of world of unpeace that I was talking about, through sanctions, through manipulation of energy prices, through information warfare, by creating lots of refugees that are going into different countries.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask, the fact that we're now seeing elements of a conventional war on the continent of Europe. I mean, does that mean that your thesis was a bit quickly disproved, or was this escalation sort of anticipated?
So my argument was not that was about the unpeace bit, that we're not going to live in a period where we had one world which was bound together by these different forces which were meant to be creating global harmony. And the subtitle of the book is how connectivity creates conflict. And the conflicts come in a very violent form, which is very shocking to lots of different people. But what I think is interesting about it is that, as I said, it's there are elements which would be very familiar to our parents, our grandparents, their parents, the horrors of war returning to the European continent. But I think the way it's being fought is quite different. If you look at the most sort of powerful tools which are being deployed by the West, they're not necessarily, there are weapons being given, and there's a very active debate about giving hard, heavy military equipment to Ukraine to help it defend itself. But the most aggressive things that the West has done towards Russia are about, cutting its banks off from the SWIFT network, introducing sanctions against the Russian central bank, talk about oil and gas embargoes. And on the Russian side, the ways that they have been most aggressive have been to do with using the war to create millions of refugees that will have an enormous political consequence, I think, in a lot of Western countries. Using cyber attacks and information warfare within Ukraine, using energy as a kind of weapon against Ukraine and against other players. And what you see is that the sort of classic military tools are just part of a much wider toolkit, which comprises lots of different ways of manipulating the ties that bind us together. And if we go back also to the origins of the war, you can see that in some ways it sort of started as a tug of war between Europe and Russia over Ukraine's future. The initial fighting started in 2014 when Ukraine was about to sign up to the Eurasian Economic Union under President Yanukovych, and when millions of or hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians started protesting against it on the streets on the Euromaidan because they wanted to join the association agreement with the European Union. Yanukovych then ended up, first of all, wanted to shoot at the protesters, then left. And when Putin felt that Ukraine was slipping forever out of his grasp, that's when he annexed Crimea and started the war in the Donbass. And, a lot of the tensions we're seeing are a result of these different connections that bind Ukraine both to Russia and to the West. And that sort of tug of war has taken on an absolutely tragic dimension in the latest war, and millions of people have been forced out of their homes, thousands have been killed. But the origins, I think, were very much to do with connectivity and the way that it was changing the nature of Ukraine in ways that Putin found, I think, terrifying.
But one of the challenges, and certainly this is an argument that Zelensky has been making both before and since the invasion, is that these sort of gray zone or connectivity related weapons that the West has been using, do they actually work against conventional military might? We saw when Putin did first annex Crimea, the West responded with sanctions, kicking Russia out of what was once the G8, but it doesn't seem to have made much of a dent.
It's certainly true that if you're faced with a leader like Vladimir Putin, who wants to invade his neighbor and is willing to pay an enormous price to do it in terms of the lives that are being dislocated and lost and killed on both the Russian and the Ukrainian side, the sanctions have not worked as a deterrent. They didn't stop him from invading Ukraine. And so far, they have not stopped the fighting either. I mean, I think that our lessons from history in terms of sanctions is that they can be quite effective, but it often takes a number of years for them to play out. If you look at the sanctions in South Africa, it was several years between the really tough and biting sanctions being implemented and the beginning of the end of apartheid. When it came to the sanctions on Iran, it took quite a long time before it encouraged political change in Iran, which led to the signing of the JCPOA, which was then ripped up by Donald Trump afterwards. So, these things are not always linear. But I think it's quite clear that Russia will be a much poorer country over time as a result of the sanctions which have been introduced than it was beforehand. And that will eventually, have some sort of effects. It's not always totally linear and predictable. Sometimes actually the sanctions can consolidate the regime. And certainly after 2014, it helped Putin have an even tighter grip on Russian society and on the Russian economy. And one of the sad things about these sanctions is they often hurt the people who are most internationalized and who are most liberal. And they help the regime consolidate its grip on the society. So that is a real danger, I think. And, it's clear also that they're not a substitute for military hardware. If Ukraine had not been able to defend itself physically from the Russian attack for so long, then we would be having very different sorts of discussions. And I think that what we need to do is to understand that geopolitics plays out across a whole series of different domains and according to different timescales as well. But I do think that what's happened is quite significant. The economic warfare, which has been being launched against Russia, and I'm sure that it will have big political consequences. Unfortunately, not probably just in Russia. I mean, we could see all sorts of problems around the world. And I think many people are worried about the food supply shortages, how they could play out in other regions, that many people could end up being collateral damage in this conflict.
Well, and indeed, those sanctions, you mentioned they will inevitably strongly affect the Russian economy, but they can also affect the European economy. And we've heard German Chancellor Scholz say that he's not prepared to do a gas embargo because it would basically cause a recession. What grade would you give Europe as far as its response so far, and where do you see it going in the future? Will we have the wherewithal to hold on to these sanctions long enough for them to have an impact?
So I think that Europeans have done much better at holding together and at reacting quickly than they did in 2014 and that they did in 2008 when the Russians invaded Georgia, and than most people expected them to do. I think the extent to which there has been a geopolitical awakening in places like Berlin, in Sweden and Finland, in Denmark, you're seeing quite profound changes in terms of how people think about their security. What's interesting is even countries that have been much more pro-Russian, like Italy and Hungary, have been much more aligned with the European consensus than many people would have expected. So I would give the kind of early response quite a high mark. I don't know what I give it out of 10, but I think that it's heartening and impressive the extent to which Europeans were willing to come together and to change long-held beliefs and taboo, to confront taboos about how their countries were being organized. My worries are more in the sort of medium to longer term. I think there are worries about European unity being maintained in the face of a cost of living crisis and with the dislocation that such huge refugee flows are going to create. I mean, it's impossible not to see the 3 million Ukrainians who've gone to Poland having enormous political consequences in that country. A lot of people say that they have blue eyes and blonde hair and that they're Christians, but so are a lot of the Poles who came to the UK, and 1 million Poles that came to the UK over a decade were enough to change the politics so much that a majority of British people voted for Brexit in 2016. And, you know, you've had several times as many Ukrainians going to Poland in a couple of months as you had coming to the UK over a decade from Poland. So I find it hard not to see that having quite big consequences, the pressures on housing, on the kind of welfare state, on the politics in countries where people are going towards. And if there is an economic recession, if there is a decision to cut off oil and gas, that will have enormous implications for inflation in different countries. The measures we take against inflation will also have kind of negative consequences. So there are, I think, all sorts of dangers of cracks emerging within Europe because it's very asymmetric. Some countries are much more affected than others. But I also think there are dangers in the world outside of Europe. For many people in other parts of the world, what's going on is not as shocking as it is to Europeans. They've seen invasions and humanitarian crises, blighting their own regions, whether it's in Africa or in the Middle East. And what they see is Europeans who are speaking in very morally charged terms about what's going on and expecting other people to follow them. And they think that actually we're being very hypocritical. You know, where were we when people were suffering in Yemen, in Syria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo? All of a sudden we are asking for people to line up with us against these different countries, against Russia, when we seem to be, far less concerned about tragedies taking place in other parts of the world. And that's also, I think, a real challenge to Europeans, the fact that we haven't managed to frame these issues in a way that that actually speaks to people outside of Europe, and that could also endanger the sort of long-term legitimacy of what we're doing. And there is a danger that Europeans and Americans get blamed for some of the byproducts of the sanctions regime. If you have people starving in Africa, if food prices go through the roof in the Middle East, that it's actually Europeans rather than Vladimir Putin who gets blamed.
Yeah, and in the West, this conflict is really seen as, the defining conflict so far of the century that will determine the future of the post-war order. You were just in Doha. What's your sense from leaders from other regions of whether they see this as the same degree of consuming crisis?
So I had the privilege of hosting a kind of private lunch with a lot of leaders from different parts of the world in Doha. And it was very interesting going into it. The Qatari foreign minister had said that what's happening in Ukraine is a real tragedy, but he pointed to the double standards in the West and said it would be great if you could show similar levels of concern and compassion to people who are being affected in Syria, in Palestine, in other places around the region. And those sentiments were very much picked up on by people from around the world. There's Hina Rabbani Khan, the former Pakistani foreign minister, was very eloquent on just how hypocritical the Western positioning looked, and how also unsympathetic other countries were to some of the ways that we're weaponizing globalization and talking about decoupling from Russia and from China. And they said that you were in favor of globalization when it was making you rich. Now that other countries are doing well, you want to turn off the taps and make it impossible for them to grow and to advance. And there were many leaders from different parts of the world. At the lunch that I was at, you had people from across Central Asia, from Latin America, from Africa, who seemed fundamentally unconvinced by the arguments which were being put forward by European ministers and people in NATO about what was going on. And interestingly, the way that people in the US often frame it as a conflict between democracy and autocracy really doesn't go over very well in many other parts of the world. I think it's more convincing if you make this case in terms of the Russian offensive being a post-colonial war and them not respecting the sovereignty of other countries. That has more resonance in other places. But there is a fundamental problem in terms of how Western moral standing is seen, that they think that we are hypocrites, that we're only interested because it's our own people who are being affected by this, and we're kind of deaf to the cries of pain in other parts of the world. And in fact, not less than that we're even complicit in a lot of the pain that people have been suffering. Is our weapons, our support for governments over many years that has created a lot of chaos and suffering in other parts of the world.
And what are the long-term consequences if that perception in other parts of the world continues? Does it have ramifications for the United Nations, for other aspects of kind of multilateral trade and cooperation?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges for Europeans, because I think more than anyone else in the world, we have put our lot in with the idea of having a multilateral world with these institutions like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and other kind of universal institutions providing solutions, whether it's on climate change, on COVID, on world trade. And these institutions are increasingly bogged down by geopolitics. China has now got a really important relationship with many more countries around the world than the US does, and than most European countries do. It's the number one trading partner to many different places around the world. And people are a bit sick of being lectured by Western countries about how to order their own affairs and what's right and what's wrong, and the sort of moral lectures that we have got used to handing out to other places are not as welcome as they once were. I'm not sure that they were ever welcome, but they seemed inevitable when Europeans and Americans controlled the vast majority of the global economy in these different institutions. So I think that we could find it very hard to see a consensus maintained in the UN, in other institutions, against the Russian aggression, in favor of different sanctions regimes. We could find ourselves being blamed for a lot of the problems that are going on in the world. And that this could actually hasten attempts by other countries to build alternatives to Western dominated institutions. So, you know, it has big implications for the future of the dollar as a global currency, but also for how we regulate the internet, how we regulate a lot of the global commons. I think people are going to be quite tempted to create institutions which allow them to bypass the West, not just actively hostile sort of rogue states, but many other countries that just don't really like the way that we seem to be loading up these institutions with our policy preferences on everything from climate change to people's stance on Russia or on human rights questions.
And we're almost out of time, and I'm going to try to do a little journalistic pirouette here. So we're speaking on Wednesday, April 20th, and by the time this airs, the French election will have occurred. We should know who the next president of France will be, whether it will be Marine Le Pen or if Emmanuel Macron will get to keep his job. So we don't have a crystal ball, but I mean, the bottom line is here, we've been talking about the West as sort of a monolith, but this very dramatic contest in France demonstrates that the West is, and its citizenry is not necessarily united. And the reality is that even if Macron wins this time, he can't run again in 5 years, and he's kind of blown up the traditional political parties. In the United States, Democratic strategists are saying it would be very easy to see how Donald Trump and like-minded Republicans could take the White House and win veto-proof majorities in the US Congress in 2024. So, you know, how should sort of more conventional Western strategists be thinking about this potentially more chaotic, less united future?
I think that's the story of the last few years, is this pincer movement. On the one hand, you have the threat from outside, from Putin, from Xi Jinping, from other strongmen who are pushing back against liberal norms at a global level. And then you have these fractures within our own societies, symbolized by Trump, by Brexit, by Marine Le Pen, by other forces. And they're, I think, all elements of this age of unpeace that I was talking about, where instead of having a kind of move towards a liberal, harmonious world where things get dealt with through cooperation, through multilateral institutions, through the rule of law, you have much more polarization, conflict between different groups, and these schisms within our own societies. And, you know, I think it's obviously too early to tell exactly what's going to happen in the French elections now. It's anything is possible. But in the same way that though Trump was defeated by Biden at the last election, it didn't defeat Trumpism. And it's very likely that the Republicans will take back control of Congress in November, and that Trump or someone like him will return to the presidency at the end of Biden's first term. These forces are very much defining how France and many other countries are being run, and whether Le Pen wins or not, you know, is something with dramatic, fundamental consequences for the future of Europe and the West more generally. But even if she loses, the ideas that she is articulating will be an essential part of French public life, and Macron is going to have to find his way of negotiating them. And I think that a lot of those forces are going to be strengthened by some of the side effects of our battle over Ukraine. You know, whether it's the cost of living crisis, whether it's the way that refugees seeking refuge across the continent. These things are all, I think, going to lead to a populist backlash in many parts of Europe.
Right. Well, an unsettling point of unpeace to end on, but we'll leave it there. So Mark, Leonard, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was great talking.